My name is Peter Coy. I'm the president of the New York Financial Writers Association, and I'm pleased to welcome you to The Art of the Scoop with David Faber. It's a session organized by Greg Miles, and I will now hand over to Greg to conduct the interview with David.
Peter, well, thanks for that introduction. Before I begin my interview, I want to say that we welcome questions from our audience. So if you want to ask a question, please send it to the chat box on Zoom, and we'll answer as many as we can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webcast. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce our special guest today, David Faber, reporter and co-anchor at CNBC. He really needs no introduction. During the past 3 decades, David has broken many of the biggest stories on Wall Street. Also, he's excelled in doing long-form documentary stories as long as 2 hours long each. He's the winner of virtually every major financial journalism award, the Loeb, the DuPont, the Peabody, Emmys, just to name a few. Now, with that said, I want to welcome David Faber. David, we're delighted to have you today.
Greg, it's great to be with you.
Well, let's start back at the beginning with David Faber, your career, okay? You started in financial journalism at Institutional Investor in 1987 in the newsletter division. I remember back then it was only available in print, right? It was a big glossy magazine that had a lot of good investment information in it. Now it's only in digital, but you worked there for nearly 7 years. You said that experience really taught you the skills on how to break news. Tell us about it.
Yeah, Institutional Investors, you said it was a magazine at the time known for its all-America team, ranking analysts. And obviously, Greg, financial journalism back then was nothing like it is today. It was a fairly quiet area of journalism. I got hired by Institutional Investor in early 87, to cover corporate lending for a newsletter called The Bank Letter, which, to your point, was put out once a week in the mail to a couple of thousand subscribers who paid a big price for it. And it covered parts of the financial services industry that, frankly, were not covered by anything else. And my beat, again, as I said, was to cover the competition between the big banks to land the big loan. I was an English major. I had never taken an economics course. I was sure that I would be dismissed in a matter of months if I got that lucky. But, so much of your career is sort of being in the right place at the right time. And it had ended up being a great place, Greg. It was a meritocracy run by a guy named Tom Lamont, who didn't care who you were, what you looked, anything. All he cared about was, can you develop sources, make relationships, and can you break news?
Yeah, you really learned to work the phones, right? In that job.
That was it. They gave you an American Express card, and they said also go out and take people to lunch. And, it was the height of uncomfortability. I remember picking up a phone and basically asking somebody on a date. That's what it was. Would you go to lunch with me? Some kid who doesn't know anything. But those were the basic tools, that have stood the test of time, making the relationships, pursuing them, developing the sources, and then being focused on trying to be first.
Look, let's move forward to CNBC, which I think you joined in 1993. As you know, I worked at CNBC from 1996 to 2000 for 5 years. While you were there a lot longer.
Yeah, we were colleagues. I remember it well, of course.
Right. Now, I watched you break your first big story on set as a young journalist, British Telecom's proposed purchase of MCI. Now, those names sound small now, but they were big names then. I wanted to ask you, how did you break that story and how hard was it?
That was really hard. It was 1996, as you say, November of 1996, and it was a $22 billion deal, which, by the way, even now, it's still a pretty big number. I had a source who had mentioned to me that somebody had told him they had a big telecom deal. And, I don't even recall if I knew what investment bank was said to be working on it, but I remember just sort of trying for weeks. And frankly, I did not have the level of sources in 1996, only 3 years on the job at CNBC, that I would have years later, nothing even close. And so I remember working on it for weeks and weeks. And I think somebody finally took pity on me, who I had called previously about, have they heard anything? You know, and as you know, you pick something else up. All right, I know it's a foreign buyer. I know basic size, and you keep sharing what you know to the extent you can. You have to be careful. Well, these days we can talk about that. It's so different. But back then, there really weren't that many people pursuing this kind of stuff. It was me for the first time at CNBC ever breaking a story, and probably the Wall Street Journal. Maybe, you know, Bloomberg barely existed, but it existed. I should say that. And I just remember building the story over 3 weeks, and finally somebody who I had spoken to along the way calling me, or I called them again, and they gave it to me. I couldn't believe it.
I was wondering, okay, that's your first scoop. To what extent did that first scoop, what elements became a model, kind of a template, you know what I mean, for future scoops? Did you use several templates, you know, from British Telecom in your future scoops?
You know, it's typically the same. I mean, and any reporter who's done it knows it's talking to as many people as you can to hear what's going on, asking. I mean, a great question I've always asked at the end of every conversation, even to this day, is anything else going on? And it's amazing what that little end of a conversation can do sometimes. And so it's those calls, and then it's getting something, and then it's working your way back through any number of sources who you think might be in a position to know. So that's kind of the template. What was different, or what we learned, that was the first time anybody had ever broken a story in the middle of the day. You know, it's 1996. I mean, it's amazingly enough going to be 27 years ago this November. And so that had never happened. And the stock went up and a lot. And I think from then on, Dow Jones started to think, well, we can't. Wall Street Journal started to think we can't hold stuff. We got to start putting things on the wire. Can't wait for the paper the next morning. I mean, it sort of changed things up, and the template really was more about, okay, when I have a story, how do we deal with it at CNBC? You know, how do we go about making sure people are aware of it?
It's interesting today. You said it's different today because, you know, if you wait a half a day to go on set to beat the Wall Street Journal in the morning, now everything's online, and somebody can beat you in 5 minutes.
No doubt. It's different. And frankly, I mean, maybe I make it as an excuse for why I don't break stories at the pace that I once did, but the half-life of a scoop is just gone down dramatically. You don't own a story for very long anymore. You break a story now and it feels like you're matched within minutes sometimes, even if you've worked on it for weeks. So that can be somewhat frustrating. And you're right, you can't wait at all. And you have to be so much more careful, I find, about who you talk to in trying to nail down a story. And when you have, and the clock starts, it's like when I have something, I'm pointing at my wrist like I have a watch, but I literally I say, okay, when am I going to start making the calls? Because I know once I start, you've got to break that story quickly, because somebody else somewhere is going to probably either hear from somebody you called and asked, and they're going to tell them because they have a better relationship with another reporter, or they want to, who knows, get a favor. You never know, Greg. So yeah, the clock starts now right away. You don't have 3 weeks. You barely have 3 hours.
Well, David, that raises an interesting issue because you get almost all of your scoops from background sources, okay? And we've got a lot of young journalists, beginning journalists out there in our audience, and also going to watch it on YouTube. Maybe their future favorite 2.0s or favorite 2.65. But if you're going to advise them, what are the 4 or 5 key things that they should look at when they cultivate and vet, and I emphasize vet, right, a source, to make sure they're reliable?
Yeah, I mean, you test your sources over time. And I mean, at this point, of course, 35, I don't even know what it is, 37 years in to my journalism career, there is hardly anybody that I haven't spoken to previously that I'm talking to. I mean, you make new sources, you always have to, but when it is somebody really new, you test them. You know, you don't go with what they tell you, and you work it over time. I mean, I wouldn't trust somebody initially. You always, of course, basics, question why anybody's telling you what they're telling you. And that, ends up sort of answering a number of questions as well. And so that's been my approach. Why is the person telling me what they're telling me? Is it in their interest? When you've been talking to somebody for years, Greg, you don't really need to do that. Sometimes, as you know, relationships span out over decades. I've had sources literally for decades. It's not about any one story. I'm not worried anybody's going to burn me over this. We have deep relationships that nobody would ever risk that for. But when it's somebody new, it's a different thing.
It's interesting, you were telling me yesterday when we were talking, you said, well, Greg, while I'm proud of all the scoops I've done, I'm also kind of lament a lot of the scoops I missed, in the past few years. When you say scoops I missed, you mean big stories, or again, just some other organization got them faster because the cycle's just much more immediate?
No, more, there's a couple. One comes to mind for some reason, or maybe I'm thankful and I'm not remembering it right now because I beat myself up about these things. But Warner Brothers Discovery, I don't know. I was so early that I truly lost track of it. I'd gotten something, as you know, I cover media for many years very closely, and I'd heard something, and it was so early that when I made calls, no one had heard about it. And it was so it was literally like, call Zaslav now, see if he'll tell me, or wait. And I waited. And then and then life, who knows, things get in the way, and weeks went by, maybe even months. And then I thought about it, I'm like, man, and I said, that thing must have just died. It must have died if it was alive. Now, by the way, I'm not going to say that I knew everything. I didn't. I actually thought it was, if I recall, what I thought I had was Turner and TBS, or something involving that, but not the whole Warner Brothers essentially going to Discovery. But I still beat myself up on that because I just sort of lost track of it, and then it broke very, very soon before they actually announced it.
Okay, well, maybe you'll get another chance in the next year as Zaslav decides to split up the company. You never know what.
Never know. No, you never know.
Let's talk about a big deal that they did break in recent years. One of the biggest was breaking the story on Disney's $71 billion purchase of most of Fox's film entertainment assets in 2019. Why do you regard that as one of your biggest?
Well, it was a fascinating story. I mean, I remember when, again, I heard it from an old great source, and I thought he heard it wrong. Wait, what? Because he didn't know everything. He's like, but I hear basically Fox is going to sell itself to Disney. I'm like, wait, Rupert Murdoch is selling? You got to go back now to the idea of Rupert Murdoch, right? Who built this company. Say what you want about him, but with grueling efficiency and tenacity. The idea that he would turn around and sell it. So first I was like, how is that possible? You obviously always say, does it even make sense? And then I started to realize, A, given who had told it to me, that it had to be true, but B, that it might make sense, that the idea that Rupert Murdoch was a seller. So that in and of itself was a pretty dramatic thing. I mean, Fox now is just sports and news. Forget, it wasn't that many years ago. It was one of the major media companies in the world, with Sky and with everything else, the cable networks, the studio. And then working on it from there, I was able to actually confirm that it was true, and reported it as such. Although it did have a level of complexity because it wasn't all of it. There was some of it, and that got a little complicated. But thankfully, I think I got most, if not all of it, right.
Yeah, it also evolved over, as I recall, a protracted period. I was wondering, as a reporter, how often do you run into journalistic dilemmas while reporting a story? In other words, let's say you may know that a source or sources or companies may make millions of dollars in profit when you publish your story, if the stock soars or it falls on the short side, but the story is also newsworthy. How do you think that through?
When it comes to something that's news, I don't think about that too much in terms of again, you always question why somebody's telling you what they're telling you. It's number one, right, on your list. But, and then you say, well, does what they're telling me even make sense? Or is it something that just doesn't? And depending on who it is, as I indicated, it can still be something you need to pursue, even if at first you sort of are left puzzled. But the area where that comes into play for me more, Greg, is on activists, reporting on activism, where by reporting it, you are helping the activist, even if they don't really have a chance, even if their arguments are crap. And in a sense, that you're helping them build their brand, which really, many of these activists, I feel like, even if they lose the battle, they can win the war by raising more money as a result of their status going up for whatever reason. So that's where I tend to think about it. And there have been plenty of times on activist stuff where I've just said, nah. Now, invariably, somebody else does it. And so you're sort of like, well, why didn't I do it? But I just sometimes don't feel comfortable with them.
But that include ExxonMobil, a few years ago. I think the shareholders that got ceased on the board, would that be one situation that you thought of, or is that not?
No, I mean, I was involved with that one the first time through, especially because remember, they had one followed the next. Engine one actually came after the first time, which was D. Shaw, and sort of an agreement they reached. I reported on that. Frankly, my reporting on Engine one was, to be honest, I just didn't think they were so small. They had such a tiny stake, which obviously doesn't really matter that much in many of these battles any longer. But I just didn't take them seriously, which was a big mistake on my part. I didn't understand. I only understood later after doing a documentary on ExxonMobil, but there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the ExxonMobil shareholder base with the company in terms of its communication through the years and how they'd been treated. And I didn't really appreciate that. So on Engine one, it was more me just not being a great reporter on that one.
Okay, let's move to, over the years, your scoops have evolved from breaking major news stories to winning major news breaking interviews with leading CEOs. And your latest scoop in May was a 1 hour, really an hour and 2 minutes interview with Elon Musk, perhaps the most sought after executive in the world. I want to know, how long did it take you to win the Musk interview, and how did you prepare for an hour-long interview?
It took me months. For me, and as you said, I've transitioned a bit. I still would love to break a story, but I don't do it as often for any number of reasons. Number one being it's really hard to break a story. But and number two, it's really hard to break a story. But I transitioned to trying to land some big interviews. And when I drew up a list of who do I want, or who have I never interviewed quite some time ago, he was at the top of the list for obvious reasons. I mean, I think it's hard to argue otherwise. He's the most consequential business person on the planet, the most important businessman, whatever you want to say. And so I started that process by thinking, okay, who do I know who knows him? Because I didn't know him. I didn't have a relationship with him. And then I sort of got, figured that out, which kind of was reporting also. And then, okay, of these people, who does he trust? Is there somebody that he actually would listen to if they said, you should do an interview with David Faber? And so, it's a process. And even then, getting Elon on the phone was virtually impossible.
You got him on the phone.
Say again?
You got him on the phone.
Well, it took me months. Yeah, it took months from texting, frankly, about the possibility of doing an interview to actually just say, well, let's talk about it. But I couldn't get to him. And then months went by, and then I got lucky enough where he took a call.
Interesting. He, as you mentioned, he's a highly unusual person, the founder of PayPal, Tesla, SpaceX, now the owner of Twitter. You were preparing for this hour-long interview, then you went into it I was wondering, as a journalist, what surprised you that you didn't expect, before you actually got in there?
Yeah, great question. And you'd asked about preparation as well. Obviously, when you have something like that, I mean, I watched a bunch of his previous interviews, which was helpful for me. You may have seen them already, but I really watched them closely. I think 4 of his interviews, more recent interviews. Obviously, you read everything you can about. Here it's so voluminous because it covers so many things. I mean, we didn't even get to SpaceX or Starlink, which is amazing. In an hour and 2-minute interview, we didn't even hit that at all. But what surprised me was, we did go to areas where I think we ended up with some very robust conversation about why he tweets or why he says what he does. But I didn't expect, frankly, Greg, the pushback or the debate about some of his tweets. Like I thought we would just sort of talk about why he does it. I didn't think that he would necessarily debate me on whether the guy in Allen, Texas, the murderer in Allen, Texas, was a white supremacist. I didn't think that we were going to get into that debate. And, you're always surprised in these interviews, and you can never be too prepared. You can never be too prepared.
One thing to look at here is, we talk about how influential Musk is across a broad range of industries, even in the area of politics. Is the financial media doing a good enough job of covering Elon Musk? What can we do better?
I mean, he is covered more than any single other person in business, as I think he should be. I don't know. That's a valid question.
I mean, because he's covered a lot. But I wonder if he's covered well. See what I mean? Like a lot of times there's this emphasis on his tweets, on what he's going to do with Twitter. I mean, in general, and they still write about Tesla, but there's this huge volume and also on his controversies. But now looking at, as you said, at SpaceX or sometimes at Tesla.
Yeah, or Starlink. I mean, think of how important that's been in Ukraine. It doesn't really ever get discussed, or at least not very often. I think you try and do what I did, right? I mean, he doesn't typically choose. He chooses odd outlets often for sharing his views. And so he does interviews. He doesn't, but he did an interview with Tucker Carlson, then he did an interview with the gentleman from the BBC that was last minute, did an interview with Bill Maher. So I felt lucky to be able to actually do what I considered a real news interview with him. And I think it was a little bit different than he was accustomed to. I think that's something you do. But I mean, I think overall, if you pick up most important financial publications, there'll be some coverage of Musk almost every day. So I wouldn't say that he's not being covered or not being covered well. I'm sure there are a lot of areas that we could still focus on. And then, listen, he's a unique individual. Love him or hate him. And, a lot of the reporters out there probably don't know him. I don't know that he has a lot of relationships. I just don't know.
Interesting. You mentioned at one point that I think when you got the Musk interview, there were no public relations handlers, which is highly unusual, which I want to ask is how, as you're dealing with public relations handlers, changed, over the past 30 years compared to when you started out.
There's just a lot more of them, right, Greg? They're everywhere. And to Musk's credit, it was a unique experience with him. He has no handlers. He has no PR people. He barely has an assistant. Sort of has a part-time assistant. So once, as I was indicating, you've sort of pursued this, and then you're getting there, you're actually arranging the interview. Unlike virtually every other time I arrange an interview, I shouldn't say that. I usually get the CEO to agree to an interview, and then it's, okay, now you got to talk to this one and that one and this one. With Elon, it was, all right, we'll do it here. What do you think about this time? I mean, he did it all. There was no PR people whatsoever. And he said to me, and nothing's off limits. I didn't even ask him. He's like, nothing's off limits. We'll do it here. 5 to 5:45 Central Time. And it was unique for me because it doesn't matter what CEO these days, they always want to at least know, well, I know you can't give me the questions, but can you give me a sense as to what you want to talk about? At the very least, you have to have that conversation. Elon, no.
Interesting. One thing I want to ask you, when you are talking to CEOs, I have a question here, by the way, I wanted to weave in now from Steve Gregory. Has the definition of, off the record and background changed over the past few decades?
Yeah, I think people's understanding of off the record and on background is different. And I think it's important for reporters, young, old, to define it with your source.
How do you
I do
define
that
it?
all the time. I do it all the time. I'm like, listen, you just said off the record. Off the record means, again, to me, that I can't use it. If I confirm it elsewhere, I'll come back to you. But off the record to me means I can't use it at all. On background means I can't attribute it to you or the firm you work for, or give any sense as to who you are. But those are two very different things. So I think a lot of times you have a source who says off the record, but really they mean on background. And it's important to distinguish with them what they mean.
They usually have to define it with on one-on-one, so both of you understand what the terms of the game are.
Yep.
I was wondering, let's talk about another form of journalism you've done that is dramatically different than scoops, and that's documentaries. You've done about 10 documentaries at CNBC, including about fraud at WorldCom, the 2007 financial crisis, the rise of the super rich, about ExxonMobil. But out of all these, you say that your 2004 documentary, The Age of Walmart, was a milestone. Can you expand on that?
Sure. It's still something I think of. I haven't watched it in ages. And as you point out, it's almost 20 years old, which just seems hard to imagine. But at the time, Walmart was the dominant retailer in American society. Obviously, it's still an incredibly important company, but this is before the rise of Amazon in a real way. And we knew so little about it. And they were such a secretive company in a sense. Just secretive makes it sound like they were up to no good, but they had no interest in sharing much. But more often than had ever been the case in their history, they were being criticized. And so I thought, and again, from a reporter's side of it, well, it's an interesting time to potentially approach them and to send them a letter. I think I sent Lee Scott a letter. He was the CEO at the time, and just said, there's a lot of questions about your company. You're being criticized more than ever. It might be a time that would you ever consider trying to communicate, trying to, allow us to come in and therefore allow you to help tell your story, or at least answer our questions. And he said, well, come down to Bentonville. And so I went down with my producers, my producer, Glenn Rockine, and I think Lori Gordon as well. And we met with Lee Scott. And I think coming in, it was favorable. And then he said, yeah, all right, we can do something. And then it was a matter of, okay, what, how, which is always the case with the documentaries. And then it ends up being a push-pull with the company, because the company will say, sure, we'll give you access, but they don't really know what that means.
Okay,
When we really want access.
You're saying that really that you, Glenn Rockine, the late Glenn Rockine, the top producer, Lori Gordon Logan, and you had to fly to Walmart headquarters, have a talk before they decided they wanted to do it. You didn't do the story there.
Nope, it was just
before you did the special.
Getting the audience with Lee Scott. That was our first thing. And talking to him and meeting him, and again, back to developing at least some sort of rapport, which is so important, where he felt some level of trust, and they said yes. And then, thanks to Lori, thanks to Glenn, thanks to Sandy Canold, and just an incredible group, I think we put a great 2-hour documentary on television. It is the backstory. Stuff is always funny. I mean, I had a battle because we had so much good stuff. We couldn't do an hour. And I got so much pushback about going to 2 hours. I had to really battle hard. And then it scored ratings, Greg, that had never been seen in the history of CNBC. I think a lot of Walmart employees have Nielsen boxes, or at least at the time did. And of course, then they just aired it. Literally, it was like it aired on a loop every night for weeks. It was the funniest thing. But
yeah, you said, I think that Bob Wright or even the top executives at NBC decided we're going to do more documentaries.
Then we actually, CNBC moved to actually create a more professional, permanent doc unit. At that point, we were just sort of doing them ad hoc. I was like, this looks interesting, that looks interesting. And then after that, they hired some people, and that started on, long form being a key nighttime programming. And obviously a lot of documentaries that I had nothing to do with, but they were excellent. And it won the Peabody and it won the DuPont. So that was great. Hopefully it stands the test of time. I haven't watched it in a long time.
Yeah, I read it. Didn't read it. Watched it. I enjoyed it. Just to clarify, then you went back. I think you went back again in 2009.
Yeah.
Again,
I regret that.
The new age of Walmart. You said you regret it. Why is that?
Yeah, I regret it a little bit. Not that I don't think it was a good piece. It was a good piece, but we went back. I just, been there, done that. And what it was what was I not doing? And I think I was coming out of having done House of Cards, which again is another one that I'm very proud of. Incredible team there as well, led by James Jacoby. And I could have probably done the blow by blow on the crisis if I had really worked at it. I think I could have gotten Paulson, Bernanke, the whole guy, all of them, to give me that blow by blow kind of documentary of what happened. With the timing might have worked. And instead I did this one. And so I always think what might have been.
So basically, it was just opportunity cost. Focus
Exactly.
on this. And we'll get to House of Cards in a second, which relates to this a bit. But in fact, let's talk about House of Cards,
Sure.
which was the 2009 documentary, where I think you won the Loeb. It looked into the causes of the 2007 financial crisis. I don't want to go into detail about really the report itself. People can watch it, on TV. But based on what you learned from the reporting for this documentary, are you confident that we can avoid another major financial crisis, or are we just going to do it all over again?
Well, it'll never be quite the same as the last one. It felt like we were on the precipice of something bad not very long ago, right? With what I call the mini bank crisis. We lost 3 pretty big banks in relatively rapid succession. Obviously, First Republic came sometime after the other 2, but it won't be the same. But I have little doubt that we will have another crisis of some kind. It won't be based on the fact that people were getting mortgages who never should have, and those mortgages were being packaged into all sorts of esoteric securities that were delivered around the world. But there'll be something else, Greg. Your guess is as good as mine.
Well, that means I'll put more money in my mattress than I planned. Okay, based on your comments. I want to say that the New York Times in 2009 described your reporting in House of Cards this way. It really struck me. It said that almost like the spirit of Christmas past, Mr. Faber visits homeowners, lenders, bankers, and Wall Street deal makers to collect a Dickensian cast of characters who explain how they were sucked into an affluenza bubble that seemed unbreakable. And I was wondering, did you feel that kind of sense of mission that the Times describes, as if you were looking for the underbelly for evil, trying to understand what went on?
Yes, I did. Actually, it's fine. Thank you for reading that. I had no recollection of that. But yeah, I did. I felt like I knew when we started to get really good stories. And again, my producers who came, found the characters, which is always such a key part in driving one of these documentaries, finding the right people to help you tell the story. And I did feel that. It was sort of like unpeeling layers. I can remember we sat down with some veteran in the mortgage industry, and he was great, and telling stories about how they were hiring guys who'd been delivering pizzas and they became mortgage brokers. And you just, putting those pieces all together, as I think we did in House of Cards, was very rewarding. It really was.
I was wondering, moving from scoops to doing documentaries is a very different style. As we talked about, reporting scoops is kind of a solo activity. You're hammering away on the phone or meeting people in person. You're doing a documentary. You're working with a whole team, as you alluded to, of producers, field producers, tape editors. How difficult is that transition, or are they somehow complementary and reinforce one another?
That's a very interesting question. I get the most professional. What's the word I'm looking for, Greg? This happens now that I'm old. I find doing documentaries the most rewarding thing that I do as a journalist. And I think in part because I love the fact that all these different elements and people can come together to create something. As you point out, I mean, you rely on the cameramen who are amazing and shoot beautifully. The editors are so important. Obviously, my producers who are helping to identify, my phones. Stop ringing, phone.
Your source can wait, David. Tell him he's got to call.
I don't know what the heck that was. Who are helping to identify the characters that you're going to use. I mean, all the way through to the writing of it, and everything, and even the promotion of it, frankly. So I love that part of doing it when it comes together right. Now, what I have learned over time is, you sort of think, well, you're an expert in your area, and I'm not going to say anything if I think something doesn't feel right. Earlier on, I would have sort of been like, well, what do I know? But now I'm like, oh no, that's not good enough. So that takes a while to get to the point where you're like, no, that's not right. That's not right. We got to do better. That's not written well. That's not shot well. We're doing it again.
I was wondering, how do you juggle doing breaking news in these investigative style, or documentaries? You got your bosses breathing down your neck for David Faber to break news on set, and then you've got the documentaries. Do they give you extra time, or do you just have to weave it in to your schedule, the documentaries?
Yeah, weave it in. I mean, frankly, hitting the phones takes a back seat, and so it just takes up a lot more time. The last one I did was on ExxonMobil. Again, one that I think we did a really interesting job on. The company is at such a crucial moment. It's such a crucial company in so many ways, always has been, but even more so perhaps with the focus on climate change and what this company is going to become. And so when I did ExxonMobil, it was a lot of travel. It's a lot of writing, and I don't do the other stuff as much. It's okay.
But the ExxonMobil documentary came out in, I think, 2022. Very recent.
Yeah, less than a year ago.
You got access to the company, but you were pretty tough on them in terms of their impact, on global warming, on floods, fires, on climate change, and also there's some skepticism there, obviously, about whether they can transform and focus in these areas. Can you talk about how you balance that skepticism, when talking to the company?
Sure. I mean, I think, listen, when you approach these companies, they have to trust that you're going to give them a fair shake, right? They have to believe that their voice will be heard. But at the same time, you have to make clear to them that if you're looking for some sort of a puff piece, or you don't want to answer criticism, then this is not going to work. And so that can be hard sometimes, particularly for CEOs, to get to a point where they're like, you know what, I want to answer the tough question. I want you to ask them because they need to be answered, and other people are asking them anyway. It's not like they don't exist if I don't hear them. And so that has to come together. But that's a balance. And I think it works well. And that's why, listen, Exxon had, I think, plenty of opportunity to sort of tell their side of the story. But we also asked them tough questions. You sat down with the CEO, usually, although we interviewed a lot of different employees, and you ask questions. They've all been well prepared. They all are on their talking points to a certain extent. But but I still think that you can break through. And I also think that just by showing, you give people a deeper understanding.
Now, you're moving toward, as we discussed, getting scoop interviews with CEOs. What's the big CEO interview that you haven't gotten yet, that you yearn for when you think about during the week?
After Musk, it's hard. You could imagine, listen, Bezos would be interesting.
You haven't gotten Bezos.
I have, but not in a long, long time.
Okay.
Not in a long, long time. 20 years ago, he would come on Squawk Box. I think you may have been, this is a long time ago, where when he felt like his company was in some sort of jeopardy, if you remember, there were some people questioning their debt load, and he would do what he had to do. And that included actually coming on Squawk Box, I think, as a guest host a number of times. So yes, I dealt with him, but I haven't in the recent incarnation, no. And I don't know that he ever will. The other thing you need for a good interview is not just to have the person sitting across from you, but have them willing to share, have them willing to actually engage. Again, back to sort of what I was saying about Exxon in a way. The subject has to be willing to answer some of the tough questions. They have to want to actually answer.
What's your feeling if you sat down with Bezos now, there would be that kind of reluctance that would not make it a good interview? It would be more couched, and couched and coached, so to speak.
That's my sense. I might be wrong. And I'd love to take the chance. I'd be happy to. But my sense is it might not be as a good an interview in a way, like as I think Musk was, in part because he answers every question. He seems to be willing to just try and, all right, let me answer that if I can.
I think I want to have a question from the audience. It's Olivia Carville. She's the vice president of the Financial Writers, an investigative reporter at Bloomberg. She wanted to know how you would advise young reporters to prepare if they want to switch beats, in financial journalism, to prepare to do the best job in making that switch.
Yeah,
sources, et cetera.
Sure. For me, it's still back to what I talked about at my very first job. It's okay. I need to learn here. Who are the people? Who are the names that I can find? Whether it's from other stories where people are quoted, or from one source who at least knows, or just based on your own, ability to say, well, who at an investment bank does this particular job? And then just trying to actually call them. We used to do, I remember even doing overcalling. In other words, making more calls than you actually need to, because it's not about making the call. You already have the story done, but it's about the next person who you can call and just talking to them, maybe developing a new relationship. And then trend stories where, you got to call like 5-10 people for a trend if you can identify it, but they also are good for meeting new sources. And then doing the old fashioned, love to get together for a drink, cup of coffee. Would you consider that? Tougher these days because people still aren't as in person. They're not in the office as often sometimes. And so it becomes a little harder to get that face to face, which I still think is really important.
How about this? I got a question from another viewer. They asked, what do you do if you get a scoop tip about an industry where you aren't as well sourced, as you are? In fact, your specialty, we could say generally, has been in tech and media, although you've broken stories on the drug industry, et cetera. But what about an industry where you're not well sourced at all?
It depends how deep I have to get into actually understanding the industry itself. M&A, I know pretty well. So when it comes to a deal, I can ask, I would hope, most, if not all, of the relevant questions around the deal without having a deep understanding, perhaps, of that world. So that's one part of it. And then, I having again done it so long, I do have certain experts in certain areas. So I have a couple of people I go to, for example, on pharma/health, old friends, sources who are incredibly knowledgeable and who can make me sound a lot smarter. Telecom, media, obviously I'm good on myself because I have very deep well of sources in those. But yes, there are certain areas where I'm not going to know as much. But you try and find somebody who can help you understand it enough, at least. Again, remember, I'm reporting typically an M&A, a transaction. So what's the price? How is it structured? Why are they doing it? What's going to happen afterward? All those kinds of questions, they're uniform across the board, regardless of industry.
And also, I think when you're going into new territory you're unfamiliar with, your antennae go up and you're a lot more careful, how you handle information. I have a question from another viewer, again, Steve Gregory. He says, have you embraced social media as a tool for reporting, which I think you have? And how do you think social media has changed the way journalism is executed?
I use Twitter. I consume on Twitter, and I use it occasionally to distribute, particularly when I have nowhere else to go, such as 8:30 at night. If I were to get a scoop tonight, I think when Musk came into Twitter, again, I wouldn't call it a huge scoop at all, but that night that they basically fired, he got the Agarwal and the general counsel, they just marched everybody out. And he and I think it was his lawyer, Spiro, and they kind of came in. I reported that, but I had nowhere else to go other than Twitter. So I tweeted it. I think it ended up being one of my most retweeted tweets of all time because there was still so much interest in that company. So I'll use it in that way, Greg, but I don't use social media much beyond Twitter. I know people use LinkedIn to get sources or to find people. Some great investigative reporters use that a lot when they need to.
Well, have you looked at increased alternatives to Twitter, considering all the problems that the company and the medium's having? Are you spreading your options a little bit, or what?
I haven't been. My main way to communicate with my viewers is on television and then on CNBC.com. So. And that's what pays the bills. I have not been. At some point, I might consider it if I really felt like there wasn't an audience or an ability to reach people that I want to reach using Twitter. I think I still can when needed. Again, almost most of the time, I'm not tweeting breaking stories. I'm tweeting stories I've done on CNBC or interviews I've done already on CNBC. So using it just to sort of try and widen the distribution of the product.
How about this? Let's get back to documentaries. I have a question from Peter Coy, the president of the Financial Writers, who has a newsletter they're back in vogue. He has a newsletter at the New York Times, an excellent one. And he wanted to ask you, wanted to get you to talk about how you work with your producers, and I think and other team members on a documentary, in terms of, I guess, putting together, let's talk about conceiving the documentary, executing it, and then writing the script. Why don't you go through that?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll come back to ExxonMobil. It's freshest in my mind.
Okay.
It's the most recent one. And frankly, there had been quite an interregnum between that and the one I had done previously. So, on ExxonMobil, after the proxy fight, which strangely we talked a little about with Engine One, it was my sense that they were, and their CEO was in a difficult position. One in which, again, they might want to communicate. They might feel like there's a need here to start to be more aggressive in communicating. We just got crushed in a proxy fight with a tiny activist nobody'd ever heard of. We lost 3 board seats. And, Darren Woods, I thought, well, if there's ever going to be a time that he would consider doing a documentary, it would be now. And so I got to him. And I got to a couple of people who I know, again, he listens to them, at least I think to some extent, in their advice. And there were people I knew well. And I got them to get there to agree. Same kind of thing as I was describing. Went down, had dinner with them, met with the team. They got them on board. And then begins the process. It's me also negotiating, frankly, with CNBC in a weird way, being like, okay, now I need resources.
You got approval from the company Now with the resources, the time, that's to get this done.
And the money.
Yeah.
And, and that's not always the easiest thing. You'd think it would be, oh yeah, my God, but everything's a battle. And to be fair, they were on board. I got an incredible team. I got the entire basically doc unit to work on this because we had a limited time period, sort of 6 months, which is tight. And Wally Griffith and a great team there immediately went into overdrive. And so that involves, again, meetings. We went down there for a full day, meeting all their different heads, trying to identify what's our story, how are we going to tell the story, who are the characters who are going to help us tell the story, where are we going to go? We're going to go to Mozambique, we're going to go to Singapore, are we going to, as we ended up going to Guyana? And you figure that out, you kind of have an idea of how you want to structure it and what basically the acts are going to look like, which is kind of what we call them. And you go in with at least some idea of how you're going to be telling the story. And then when you get all the interviews done and you know all the transcripts, then you start writing. And
Now, who writes the script? I know that you're involved deeply in the script, but who writes the script first? And then I think it goes back and forth with you and the producers, right?
Yes, and in this case, we had different producers on different sections, taking the lead. And then we would all sit in a room and go over them and over them and over them and over them. Writing it's the hardest part. You get down to literally every word, and then you always have to cut. Cutting is just brutal. You have to cut for time. It always works that way. In fact, ExxonMobil went 58 minutes. So again, CNBC was like, oh, what are you doing to us? We can't run any ads. Should have been 44 minutes. It was 58 minutes. So of course, then they hardly ever ran it, and it went on Peacock. And frankly, I don't think it got the kind of viewership that I would have liked to have seen for something we worked so hard on. But yeah, the writing is the producers, and then with me, and then we're all in a room, and then I'll get involved, not as much as I once did. More now I'm sort of, let's try and rework that. Then you track everything. Then you go into
what if you disagree about the story angle? Sometimes you say, I think the company's either doing lousy or they're doing well. See what I mean? I mean, that's kind of a subtext, and you have to make a decision.
There was one section in particular, the Guyana section, I remember, we're not telling this the way I imagined it, or I think or the best way for us. And it was a complete rework. So yeah, you do have those.
Explain what you mean by Guyana. You mean, is that where you had the oil well out?
Yes, that's where I went to the oil platform 100 miles off the coast. I mean, one day Exxon could be delivering as much as 1 million barrels a day from there. Yeah, that's what I had to get helicopter ditch training for, all the crazy stuff. But yes, that was that part. But it's fascinating, Guyana, because of course they're producing all this oil, but they're also right at the forefront of suffering from climate change. They're on the water, and the water's rising fast. And so I thought that juxtaposition was amazing, and I felt like initially we weren't telling it the way we needed to. We did eventually do it the right way.
Yeah, I saw that documentary. I'm glad your helicopter landed, made it onto the oil deck. I got a question here from Britt Tunnock. She's the executive manager of the Financial Writers, and she wanted to know about what it's like interviewing Bob Iger over the years, which is interesting. When he first became the CEO, people were extremely skeptical that he would be good at all, and he been quite successful. But talk about your experience interviewing him and how it's evolved.
I've known him for a very long time, for any number of reasons, actually, many of which have to do with my job, but not all. And so, again, it goes back to relationship and having somebody trust you. We've had a good relationship, although not one without its moments of contention, because invariably, when you know somebody that long and they're in a position of power, you're going to say some things that they don't agree with. But to his credit, that's never impacted our ability to communicate. So it starts there. It starts with having somebody who feels comfortable with you, who trusts you, and I certainly expect that that's the case with Bob and I. So I've done any number of interviews with him through the years. And of course, you also establish a rapport with somebody when you know them off camera. You are more comfortable with them on camera, and it makes a better conversation, I think. And that's the case with him. So I think we've done some very interesting, good interviews. They've been tough interviews, but he's an amazing communicator. And again, he's not unwilling to take the tough questions. And so, you know, I mean, there's three that I remember. One, when they announced Disney Plus, we did a long interview that night. And obviously dealing with all these questions at that point about this world and how it would look and what it would look like and whether it would be profitable. Many of the same questions still being asked. Then we did his exit interview. He chose to, you know, we did one interview, hour long, all looking at his career and obviously talking about a lot of things. I thought it was a fascinating conversation. That was, of course, the end of 2021. Never did I expect that he would be back in the same job, or as CEO at least, less than a year after his exit interview. But then we did another interview after their first quarter earnings when they were in the midst of that proxy fight with Nelson Peltz that took place early this year. So I think very fondly of a lot of those interviews, and I look forward to more of them if he'll have me.
Related to Bob Iger here, obviously they're in the streaming business. That would be an understatement. But how do you feel the streaming business has affected documentaries in general and their dissemination and their viewership?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on this, Greg, but my sense is that it's given, you know, the ability to obviously do a lot more of them. I don't know how well they're being viewed, but there are a lot of documentaries available on various streaming platforms. And for a period there seemed to be a good amount of money, at least potentially, for them. So my sense would be that's kind of been a positive, although again, these days it's so hard to find, you know, there's so much content that it's really about curating, figuring out what, you know, knowing what you really want to see.
I got one last question for you, David. It's from me. I just wanted to say something here. You know, you cover M&A. That's been your primary beat. And, you know, when you think of the free market economy, mergers and acquisitions are supposed to enable the efficient reallocation, right, and use of assets and a market economy. Now, based on your experience looking over the past 30 years, are companies and executives making, you know, smarter or dumber decisions today regarding deals than 30 years ago?
Oh, Greg. You know, I mean, there's still emotion. It's amazing. I guess it shouldn't be because we're human beings. There's still emotion sometimes in deals. There's still, people get wrapped up in things and that desire to own it or to, you know, win. And I think sometimes that leads to bad outcomes. I do think that companies are more aware, perhaps now than they might have been in the past, that, you know, a lot of deals are really hard to do well, and you have to be darn well certain that this is something that you both can buy at the right price and then execute on. I'm not talking about a smaller deal. I'm talking about the consequential deals.
Yeah.
But I certainly think there's to be fair, a very much spotty track record of whether deals have really succeeded or not. And I can obviously list a number that have been terribly detrimental for the companies that did them. I mean, I can, you know, I mean, whether it's Sprint Nextel or Bayer Monsanto, or of course, my first documentary, Time Warner AOL.
Yeah, that was a big one. Look, David, as I told you before, we've run out of time. We got to go.
Okay.
I want to thank you for your fascinating insights on how you break news and execute documentaries. I deeply appreciate you sharing your thoughts with members of the association, also guests